Hello, welcome back. We have moved on from the basics of ggplot2, and before we go into any more technical details or specific things about specific kinds of visualizations, what I do want to talk about is pre-processing your data. This is an oft neglected part of data visualization, but it is absolutely necessary. It's pretty rare, actually, that you get a data set in your lap that is just ready to go that you can put into your visualization software. You usually need to do some things to it to clean it up, put it in the right format that you need before you can do anything with it. Now, depending on the kind of software that you're using, typically I'll be using R. There's a lot of different tips and tricks and things that you need to know about how to manipulate data. I'm not going to do that in this video simply because it is such a large topic that I'm not going to be able to fit it in here. Instead, I will point you to some resources I will put in the description. I have some links to some dplyr videos that I've already made. I also have some links to a Swirl course that will help walk you through using dplyr in R to help prepare and manipulate your data. In this video, instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about what you want to think about as you're doing data cleaning. And in particular, what you want to think about when you have a goal of having a data visualization at the end of it, right? So not necessarily what are the technical tools that you're going to be using, but what is it that you're doing? Right? What's the whole point? What's the whole purpose? What's the idea of what you're doing when you are trying to clean and manipulate your data? And so the best advice that I can give when you're thinking about cleaning and manipulating data is to start from the end. Start by thinking about your goal. What is the end product that you want to have? Now, and in the case of a visualization, that often means a particular graph or table that you would like to create. Once you have an idea of what it is that you're trying to do, you can then work backwards a lot more easily to think, okay, now that I know what I want it to look like. So I know, and from stepping back one from that, I know what my data needs to look like so that I can create that graph that I want. Then I can say, okay, well, now I have this data that I'm starting with. How can I turn these data points into the data that I need to graph the graph that I want? And thinking about it in that way is, I think, going to make it a lot easier for you. So let me give you an example. So let's say that we are going to try to create this graph right here. So what is going on in this graph? So this is a graph of vocabulary scores for women and men over the decades on a particular test that has been administered over and over again. So what do we have here on this graph? This is the goal graph that we would like to create. So one thing to think about is, what are the points on this graph? What are the actual data points that are being plotted here? Which sometimes that will just be a data point from some raw data, but often it will be some sort of calculation that you've done that you are then taking the calculation and you are putting it on a graph in some way. So in this case, notice, for example, we don't have individual people's scores on here. We have a single point every decade for men, and we have a single point every decade for women, right? So this already tells us where we need to go. It's going to be a lot easier to do most forms of data visualization if you have one point of data in your data set for every point that you want to be on your graph. Now, this doesn't always have to be the case, but generally this will make things a lot easier for you, especially if you're working in something like Excel that has a very hard time taking lots of data and putting it into one point on the graph. But even if you're not working in Excel, if you're working in R, in ggplot, or if you're looking in Tableau, that can handle a little bit better doing some calculations between your data and the graph. It will be easier if you can do some of those calculations and pre-processing yourself, because then it doesn't have to do as much work. You know that you're going to get what you want. So what do we want here? Well, looking at this, we have 10 points of data. We have the average vocabulary score for each gender in each year. So that's our goal. We want to have 10 data points in our final data set. We want to have 5 for men. We want to have 5 for women. Of those ones for men, it's going to be 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, and same thing for women. Those are going to be our 10 points. What data are we going to have on each of those 10 points? Each of those 10 rows of data. We're going to have the decade that we're talking about. That's the variable that we have on the x-axis. We're going to have the average vocabulary score. That's what we have on the y-axis. And we're going to have the gender that we are referring to, men or women. So that's our goal. Okay, so now that we have our goal in mind, we can go and actually look at the data that we have. Here's the actual raw data that we have. So what do we have here? So first of all, you can see we have way more than 10 data points, right? So there's already some pre-processing that we're going to have to do. So what is the data that we currently have? What is the level of the data? That's a good question to ask. And what I mean by what is the level of the data, what I'm asking is, what does one row of data mean? Right? So in our target, one row of data is going to mean this is the row of data for this decade for this gender. All right? There is one row of data per decade per gender is what the level of data is there. How about here? What is their one row per? Well, there's many different men and many different women at many different education levels in this data set. But what this is that each row is one person. So we are going from one person in 1 year who is of a particular gender and a particular education level to one row per gender per decade. Okay? So how can we do that? And so how do we want to take these individual rows that we have, where we have multiple rows per data point that we want to plot in the end? We want to collapse those down just to get the single point that we want to graph. Now, the specifics of doing that in any particular graph is going to be different. In this particular case, I basically just want to take the average of that vocabulary score. You can see the vocabulary column there. I want to take the average of that column for each decade, for each gender. Now, if I was doing this in dplyr, I can tell you that I would do that with a group by. I would group by decade and gender. Noticing, by the way, I don't have a decade variable in here. I have years. So I got 1974 there. I got, what else do I got? It's always good to look through your data by hand, by the way, before you start working with this, so you know what's in there. I got 1988. Yeah, these aren't decades. I got 1987. If I want to go but to the decade level, I need to first collapse that down. So the first thing I would need to do is I need to create a decade variable. I would need to think, okay, I have a year variable. What can I do to that year variable to turn it into a decade variable? Lots of different ways you can do it. A common one that you might do would be to round it down to the nearest tens place. And that would tell you what decade it is. So I would say take the year variable, round it down to the nearest tens place, create a new decade variable. That'd be the first thing that I would do. Then I would do a different calculation for each combination of gender and decade. So again, in dplyr, I would do a group by of gender, called sex here, and decade. And so what that's going to do is that's going to do a separate calculation for each combination of gender and decade. And when I get out of the result, if I summarize the data to that level, I will get data that is now at the gender decade level. In dplyr, group by and summarize will give you back data that is at the group by level. Right? So that's one row per decade per gender, which is exactly what we wanted to end up with in the first place. Right? We had our goal of one row per gender per decade. Now we know how to get there by grouping by gender and decade and summarizing. If I was working in Stata, I would use collapse by gender and decade. If I was working in Python, I believe it would also be group by, and you would do a similar thing there. That's the basic idea. I know where I am. I know where I want to get to. So I would use a mean function within summarize to take the mean, the average of the vocabulary score within gender and decade, that decade variable I just created, which would give me the data set that I wanted, which would then be very easy to plot. I just take those 10 points and I put them on the graph. All right, that's the basics of it. Again, this is not a technical overrun. This is just the idea, the theory behind how you will want to think about doing data cleaning and before you get to the point where you can actually graph those points. Thank you.